I told you privately in an email, I read and loved the book. And
Thanks.
what I really appreciated about the book is that I think you had a difficult task in wanting to have enough inside information for the fanatic, to salve all the desires that they have for the nitty gritty. But it's also approachable for the casual fan, and the stories in it are just terrific. So congratulations. And I'll also give a shout out to Temple, because I think that the production values and the packaging are extraordinary and the photographs are well done. So it's something about which I think you should be really proud.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, and I'm glad you said that about the Temple Press people. They did a really wonderful job putting it together. It's a really handsome book. I love the way it looks, and I'm happy you like the way it read.
I have a habit of reading acknowledgments first. I go to the end of the book. In your case, that would be the epilogue, and I'm always rewarded with a nugget when I get there. In your case, it's 1995. You're recognized with the Dick McGann Award from the Professional Football Writers of America. You are fielding many congratulatory notes and messages, including receiving a communication from Ed Gebhardt, Ed Gebhardt of the Delaware County Daily Times, where you had worked for a year in 1968.
Yeah.
What was his message, and why was that his message?
That was the first job I got out of college. I graduated from Temple in June of '68. Started to work at the Delaware County Daily Times. Graduated on a Friday, started at the Daily Times on Monday. And they didn't have an opening in the sports department. The only opening they had was on news side. They had 3 sports writers. They didn't have enough budget to add a 4th. So the editor said, we'll hire you, but it's not going to be for sports. You're going to be covering news. You're going to be covering media courthouse. You're going to be covering transit strikes, murder trials, bake sales, all that kind of stuff. I said, fine. I was just happy to have the job. But I knew that on a typical Saturday in the fall, they couldn't cover all the Delaware County high school football with just 3 guys. So there were going to be a couple games out there that they needed other guys to work. So I volunteered, and Ed Gebhardt was the sports editor, longtime sports editor, had been there forever. And he always gave the best games to his 3 sports writers, the three staff guys. And those of us that were either freelancers or news side guys picking up a little overtime, we kind of got the B-list games. And so 4 or 5 weeks into the season, I kind of got tired of seeing Sharon Hill. I kind of got tired of seeing Clifton Heights. Nothing personal. But I'm starting to feel, hey, come on, I want to see a big game. And the big school out there, and it still kind of was Ridley. Ridley is a real power and has been a real power in high school football for a long time. And so I kind of wanted to go see Ridley. And so sort of summoned up my courage one day, and I walked over to Ed Gebhardt's desk, and I said, hey, Mr. Gebhardt, just thinking, how about letting me cover Ridley on Saturday? And Ed looked up at me, looked over, peered over his glasses at me, and he said, yeah, you're not ready for Ridley. So I went off to Sharon Hill again that weekend, but it always sort of stayed with me, this idea, you're not ready for Ridley. But as you point out, 1995, after I get the Dick McGann Award at the Pro Football Hall of Fame, for years of covering pro football and stuff, I came home and there was a whole bunch of cards and letters and very nice wishes from people saying congratulations, nice career achievement. But I went to the telephone and there was a voicemail message. And as soon as I hit the button, I recognized Ed's voice, and Ed said, okay, Didinger, you're ready for Ridley.
Oh my God. I love that, because it suggested that as it had hung with you, he had also remembered when he had to give you that line those many years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly right. Yeah. I laughed so hard. And I've been at a couple dinners, like Ridley Township Old Timers, Delco Sports Hall of Fame, a couple of events over the years where Ed has been on the dais. And I've told that story and always gotten a big laugh. And the person who laughs the loudest is Ed.
Love it. Maybe it was all preordained. Our Lady of Peace, Sister Claire Ursula, Didinger, you should be a writer, she says.
Fifth grade. She was my fifth grade teacher. Very tough. Woo, very tough, as the Sisters of St. Joseph's tended to be, probably still are. She gave us an assignment in class one day. She said, write an essay. Everybody in class, I want you to write an essay about the person you most admire. And so everybody just puts their heads down and they start writing, me along with everybody else. And I wrote an essay about my father, because even at fifth grade, I just found him to be just an incredibly admirable person, World War II veteran, guy that worked multiple jobs, went to night school. Even in fifth grade, I knew that he was made of pretty stern stuff. And so while all the other kids are writing essays about Davy Crockett and President Eisenhower and a couple girls writing about Elvis Presley, I wrote this essay about my father. Didn't think a whole lot of it. We all turned the stuff in. And the next day, Sister Claire came into class with all the papers marked. And she starts off by saying, I want to read you all an essay written by one of your classmates. And she starts reading it, and I immediately realized, I said, wow, that's mine. And she read through the whole thing. And when she got to the end, she said exactly what you said, Mike. She said, Mr. Didinger, you should be a writer. And Mike, it was the first time in my life anybody ever told me I was good at something. And when that happens for you, whether it's the third grade, the fifth grade, the eighth grade, whenever, it's pretty profound, and at that point, I can't tell you I knew at that moment that I was going to go and study journalism in college, but I started thinking about it. And that was really one of the first big moments in my life that I began to think that this writing thing might actually lead somewhere.
I loved that you gave shout outs to your St. James High School English teachers, Donald Bell and John Mooney. Ray, there are many moments in the book, and when people read it from our area in particular, they're going to similarly say, I remember exactly where I was when that happened. And there was one particular instance where our lives, the two of us, intersected in a way that you don't know. It's the summer of 1970, and at Albright College in Reading, you are now at your first Eagles training camp. Interesting, by the way, for among other reasons, John Carlos is 2 summers removed from raising a fist in Mexico City. Yeah. I love this story. He's a sprinter. He's a runner. He doesn't know how to put on his pads. What happened?
Yeah, you're right, Mike. I think most people, many people remember John Carlos and Tommy Smith at the '68 Olympics. On the medal platform, Tommy Smith wins the gold, John wins the bronze. And when they're presented with their medals on the platform in Mexico City, they bow their heads and they had a black glove on, and they raised their fist in a black power salute, protesting racial injustice in America. At that time, it was considered beyond shocking. And there was a huge uproar, and the USOC sent them home immediately. They didn't even get to stay with the team. Sent them home. They came back to this storm of criticism in this country, and were really vilified. And their careers kind of brought to an end. Their opportunities dried up in track. And here's John Carlos, looking around for something to do. And 1970, the Eagles just decided, oh, what the heck? Let's just draft this guy and see if we can turn him into a football player. He was 6'4", he was 215 pounds, and he could run like the wind. So they draft him in the 15th round of the draft. Carlos comes to the training camp, Albright College in Reading. I'm a rookie reporter. It was my first year covering the team. And the very first day of practice, we were allowed in the locker room then. We're not now, but we were then. And me and another writer were walking out of the locker room, and everybody's out on the field. They're already started practice. And we look down this row of lockers. There's one guy, and it's John Carlos. And he's standing there, and he's in a T-shirt and socks and nothing else. And all of his equipment is spread out on the floor around him. And and the other writer, Billy Shevsky of the Daily News, says, "You got a problem?" And he says, "I don't know how to put this on." And he had never worn a football uniform before. I mean, he had never played organized football. He had played touch football in the streets of Harlem, but he had never played any organized football.
Wow.
He never played helmet, shoulder pad type of football. So all of this stuff, I don't know if anybody in the audience really appreciates, if you've never put on a football uniform before, somebody kind of has to show you how to do it. Somebody has to show you where the pads go and all that stuff. And so John had no idea where to begin. And so Billy and I, it's hardly our job description, but we can't leave the guy just standing here. So we went down there, and he and I and one player, one teammate, actually kind of came in and helped us a little bit. The rest of the guys just kept going. And we dressed John Carlos for his first practice in the NFL.
The reason that our lives intersected is that at that camp at Reading, my father, who was a high school and college football official, got, for him, like the call of his life to referee a scrimmage between the Billy Kilmer Redskins and the Eagles. And my brother and I held the first down chains for that scrimmage. I'll never forget it. So I was there as like a, 8, it may have been the next year, 9-year-old. You were there in your first camp. I was surprised, and I think that some of the viewers will be surprised, that in the book, when you describe your most memorable Eagles team, it's not the Super Bowl champions, it's the Buddy Ryan Eagles of the 1980s. Why?
The makeup of the players, the characters, the personalities. That was an exciting, combustible, chaotic locker room with a whole bunch of oversized personalities, and Buddy was all of that himself as a coach, and it was just this daily bubbling stew of testosterone and ego, and you just never knew what was going to happen. And I had never seen it quite to this degree. You really had two different teams. You had the offense and you had the defense. And every day in practice, there were fights. I mean, every day in practice, there were fights. And largely, it was largely a Buddy's doing, because Buddy was a defensive guy. And the defensive players were that was his baby, was the defense. He paid all of his attention on the defense. And those guys could get away with murder, and they did. And so on the practice field, and they were rough. I mean, it was Seth Joyner and Reggie White and Jerome Brown and Clyde Simmons and Wes Hopkins and Andre Waters. I mean, they were a tough bunch. And it wasn't just on Sunday. They were tough on Wednesday at practice, too. And on practice, they would just beat up on the offense. And finally, the offensive guys would just have enough of it. And there were fights all over the place. And the thing that I always remember about those training camps and about those practices was the fight would start inevitably. And the other coaches would kind of run in and try and break it up. And Buddy would just stand off to the side. Buddy had his whistle. And Buddy would just stand off to the side. And he would just twirl his whistle. He would just stand off to the side, twirl his whistle with this impish kind of grin on his face that, all right, just break it up, fellas. Come on, just break it up. It was such a contrast to the Dick Vermeil teams, where everything was regimented, everything was about discipline, everything was about we're all in this together, guys. Buddy took it in a totally different direction.
So I want to ask you about the Vermeil era, and more particularly, my favorite part of the book. You have a whole chapter 9, The Peddler's Son, about a guy that fascinates me. And I just wish the movie had been made. And I'm talking about Leonard Toews. And I can't get enough of the stories of he and Jimmy Murray, including the picture that you paint of the two of them on this renegade mission out to the Beverly Hills Hotel to try and recruit Vermeil, who's just won the Rose Bowl, to come to Philadelphia. Vermeil pulls up, I think you said, in a baby blue Mustang. Right. And now they're trying to cajole him at the Beverly Hills Hotel to come to Philadelphia. And Vermeil mentions, and Ray, this is another for me of I was there. Vermeil mentions the 42-3 loss to the Rams on Monday Night Football where golf balls come down from the 700 level, and he wants to know if it's true. And Jimmy Murray says to Vermeil, if you come to Philadelphia, you'll never leave.
You'll never leave.
How the hell did they close that deal?
You'll never leave. Mike, you described it very well. There's really not a whole lot I can add to it. First of all, Leonard Toews had no idea who Dick Vermeil was. He had just fired his third coach, and he's casting about looking for the next coach. And they had interviewed half a dozen guys, including Joe Paterno. And Leonard wasn't sold on any of them. And so comes New Year's Day, and he and Jimmy Murray are together and are flipping around watching the various bowl games. And they flip over to the Rose Bowl. And all of a sudden, Jimmy says, whoa, look at this. UCLA's knocking off Ohio State. This is an upset. Ohio State was undefeated. They were heavily favored, number one team in the country. A lot of people were saying, like, the greatest college team of all time. And UCLA is spanking them in the Rose Bowl. And as Jimmy describes it, they cut to a close-up of Vermeil on the sidelines, this UCLA coach. And he's 39, handsome as all get out, and just coaching his butt off. And as Jimmy describes it, he says he looked like Robert Redford and he coached like General Patton. And Leonard Toews says, "Who's this?"
Right.
And he says, "Well, that's Dick Vermeil. He's the coach of UCLA." And Leonard says, "Oh, we got to go talk to this guy." Now, 5 minutes ago, he had no idea who this guy was. Now he's ready to offer him the job. They hop on a plane the next day, fly to Los Angeles, and call Vermeil's office. They check into the Beverly Hills Hotel, get their cabana by the pool.
Sure.
Call Vermeil and say, "Hey, we want to talk to you about the Eagles job." Vermeil says, "Not interested." Hangs up. And one of the other guys, Carl Peterson, who's in the office with him, says, "Dick, you can't do that. At least you got to go talk to them. My God, they flew all the way across the country." So Dick calls back and says, "All right, I'll come over, but I'll tell you, it's just a courtesy. Just a courtesy, because I really have no great desire to leave here." He had a great job. He's a native Californian, never coached outside of California. He's just beaten Ohio. He's just beaten Woody Hayes in the Rose Bowl. His stock has never been higher. He's got kids lined up all the way to Wilshire Boulevard wanting to sign up and play for him. He's got the greatest job in the world. And he walks in and he says to Jimmy Murray, "Why in the world would I want to leave here and come to Philadelphia and coach the Eagles, a team that hadn't won in forever?" And Jimmy goes into the thing about how passionate a fan base this is, how long they've been down, how desperately they want to win. And Jimmy says to him, "These people are so desperate, they will give you a standing ovation if you win the coin toss." And then he follows up with the promise that you just talked about, which is, and Jimmy says, "The people in Philadelphia, you can't appreciate how great they are and how much they love this team. And I guarantee you, you will love the people in the city. You will love the city. If you come to Philadelphia, you will never leave." And
he hasn't.
Dick just buys it. He totally believes what Jimmy says. He understands what he's taking on, which is a broken down team that hasn't won in a decade, has traded away all their draft choices. I mean, it was probably the worst job in football, but Jimmy talked Dick into taking it. And with that, they totally changed the direction of the franchise.
The rest is history. Hey, let me switch sports because I could keep you to myself all night long, but I'm limited on time, and I'm going to ask some questions proposed by the audience in a moment. On the Phillies front, you speculate in the book that Mike Schmidt was booed more than any other athlete in the city history. Mm-hmm. Why?
I don't know. And I don't know that that's totally factual. And in fact, I think I write in the book that I don't know how you measure things like that.
Right.
Who was booed the most? Who could say? Look, we all kind of remember, at least I'm old enough that I remember Dick Allen, and I remember what Dick Allen went through here, and he was certainly booed. We heard Norm Snead booed at Franklin Field a lot. Later on we heard Ryan Howard booed. We heard. I think the only guy that I can honestly say that in the 50 years I've been watching sports in Philly or covering it, the only one I never heard booed, honestly never heard booed, was Dr. J. I don't think I ever heard Doc booed in Philadelphia. Don't think so. Bobby Clark maybe too. But but it's a very small club. But Mike, if he wasn't booed the most, he might have been booed the most unjustly. When you consider what a great, truly great player he was. He was, I don't know how many people realize this. In fact, when I was writing the book and I began looking up his numbers, I mean, I covered him throughout his whole career. I knew it. I wrote it over time. But even when I looked at the numbers, even I was stunned at some. He won the National League home run title 8 times. He led the National League in home runs 8 different seasons. The only hitter in Major League history that won his league home run title more, not Barry Bonds, not Hank Aaron, was Babe Ruth, who led the American League in home runs 14 times back in the dead ball era. But in the modern era, no hitter led his league in home runs more than Mike Schmidt did. I mean, his numbers are just staggering.
The reason that I bring up the boo factor with regard to Schmidt, and I hope I'm not giving away too much, is that one of the questions that people always want to ask of Ray Didinger is, please rank the athletes you covered.
Sure.
And a guy that you speculate may have been booed the most is also your number 1 ranking by a whisker over Reggie White.
Yeah, I think that's true, Mike. I felt like in doing the book, I couldn't very well do a book about my 50 years of covering Philly sports without somewhere in the book saying, who did I think was the greatest athlete I covered? It would have been a major cop-out. But I knew it was going to be a tough decision because I covered some great ones. And I finally came down to, to me, it was a choice between two. It was a choice between Mike Schmidt and Reggie White. Each of them was the best I ever saw play in their position. Schmidt was the best third baseman I ever saw, and Reggie was the best defensive end I ever saw. So I thought it was between those two. And as much as I loved Reggie and respected Reggie, and I still think he's one of the greatest players ever, I had to give it to Schmidt in terms of his longevity and just the fact that as an all-around player, hitting with power, run the bases, fielding, guy won 10 Gold Gloves. He was the complete package at third base. So yeah, I picked him as my number 1 guy. But you're right. I think that he got booed viciously throughout his career, and was largely because of kind of his persona. He was by his own design. He was very cool. He was kind of Mr. Cool. He just played the game in almost an effortless looking fashion. And Philadelphia, listen, we all know who's popular in this town. It's a guy that gets their uniforms dirty. It's a guy that gets their nose bloody. It's a guy that dives headfirst into the bases. Schmidt was never like that. I mean, I write in the book that Schmidt looked like he played the game in top hat and tails. He really did. I mean, he was that good and he could get away with it. And the fans here, they kind of wanted more. I remember saying one time to Mike, I said, you know what, you and Ron Say should really change teams.
Right. You tell us.
I said, you should go, you would be perfect in LA. The whole cool thing, the sunglasses, you'd be perfect in LA. And Ron Say, with that penguin waddle and that funny little stumpy body that he had, the Philadelphia fans would love him. And of course, Mike just totally took it the wrong way. And so, what are you saying? Ron Say's better than I? I said, no, I'm not even suggesting that. It's not even a question. I'm just saying in terms of what those fan bases relate to, the kind of players that they really like. I said, you'd be great in LA. And Ron Say would be a hero here because he'd have his uniform dirty every night. That's all I'm saying. And I remember Schmidt saying, you guys are unbelievable. But that was just Schmidt. That was kind of the relationship we had. But when I had to sit down and pick what I thought was the greatest player that I saw in Philadelphia in 50 years, in the end, it was actually a pretty easy call. It was Mike Schmidt.
So the book, people should know, is not just a concentration on what I would regard as the big 4 in Philadelphia. And some of my favorite stories deviate beyond the Flyers and Sixers and so forth. I loved, and I'll just float it out there as an invitation for people to buy the book. I love you covering in the mid 80s, the pro wrestling circuit and the role played by your wife, Maria, and Andre the Giant. They'll have to buy the book to hear that story. Something else that jumped out at me, Ray, because I remember Frazier Ali won at the Garden. It's 1971. I'm living in suburbia. My recollection is, a young kid. My recollection is that my brother and I had a transistor radio tuned to WFIL who had someone at the Spectrum watching the closed circuit who would call in round by round and give you a feel for what had gone on. Okay, you're at the Spectrum that night, but a few years later, you're at Deer Lake and you are with the greatest. And what did he want to know from Ray Didinger?
I went up to Deer Lake to interview LA. He was training for another fight. And it was just him and me alone. I don't know how many people have ever seen pictures of Deer Lake. Deer Lake was way up in the mountains near Pottsville. I mean, you could get lost so easy getting up there. Most people did. And I was the only reporter there that day. So I had Ellie alone to myself in his log cabin. And I'm interviewing him, and we're sitting at this little card table. That's what I describe it. We're talking for about an hour and about a lot of different things, great fighters in history. And I bring up the name of Joe Frazier. At this time, he had fought Frazier once. And Ellie says, "Do you see my fight with Joe Frazier?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I was at the closed circuit at the Spectrum, watching it on the big screen." And Ali leans across the table until his nose is like that far from my face. And he says, "Who was you rooting for?" Now, just imagine that, okay? Imagine that moment. You're alone in a log cabin with Muhammad Ali. His face is right here, and he's asked you that question, okay? And look, I knew what he wanted me to say, but the simple fact of the matter is I was rooting for Joe Frazier. And so I, in my mind, a million things are going through my mind, but I finally say, you know, he asked me an honest question. I got to give him an honest answer. And I looked right in the eye and I said, I was rooting for Joe Frazier, not knowing what he was going to do. And he just fell back in his chair and he looked at me. He said, "Why was you rooting for Joe Frazier?" And I said, "I'm from Philadelphia. I was rooting for the home team." And he just looked at me, and I really didn't know where the thing was going to go from that. But he said, then all of a sudden, his expression changes, and he says, "You know something? I respect you for telling me that." And it was a funny thing, Mike, because the whole drive back to Philadelphia after leaving Deer Lake, the whole drive back, I'm rolling this around in my head. What's he talking about? You know, respect. Why? Respect what? You know, that I wanted Frazier to beat him. And I still don't know exactly what he was thinking, but the best thing I can make sense out of it is, you know, he was so surrounded by people that just patted him on the back and said, "Champ, you're the greatest, you're the best, whatever you want, champ." And to have somebody just give him a straight answer to something was, it was something, even though it wasn't what he wanted to hear, he could kind of just appreciate the honesty.
Right. I grew up idolizing Bernie Perrant. You know, our family had the bumper sticker, "Only the Lord saves more than Perrant." I'm sure you and everybody listening and watching remember. So February 1979, he suffers that freakish eye injury. You are the only reporter at the hospital, and it's a very poignant moment. And in the book, you describe being uncomfortable at the access that you've been given.
Very, because it was a Saturday afternoon, and I was the second guy covering for the Bulletin. Jack Chevalier was the beat guy. He was writing about the game. I was there to just do a sidebar of some kind. And during the game, all of a sudden, there's this freakish sort of scramble in front of the goal. Jimmy Watson pulls down one of the New York Rangers. His stick swings back, and the tip of his stick goes in the eye hole of Bernie's mask. I mean, it's just 8 million to 1 thing, freak. But that's what happens. The tip of the stick goes right into the eye hole and hits Bernie right on the eye. He flips the mask off, skates off the ice with his hand on his eye, clearly in pain. Goes up the tunnel, and like 5 minutes later, they announce that we're taking, Bernie's now being taken to Wills Eye Hospital for examination. And Jack Chevalier says to me, "You go. I'll stay here and cover the game. You go and just see what's going on with Bernie." At that time, we didn't know how bad it was. We just thought maybe he got a grazing kind of thing, and this is just precautionary. So I get in the car and I drive up to Wills Eye Hospital, which was on Spring Garden then. And I go in and they tell me what room Bernie's in. I go up to the room. There's nobody else around. I'm in a room by myself. And then all of a sudden, I see him and his wife, Carol, coming up the hall. And he's in a wheelchair, and he has both eyes covered with gauze and taped. And Carol's crying. And I thought, oh my, this is serious. And they bring Bernie in. The nurse pushes him in. And she sees me standing there. She says, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm a reporter from the Bulletin." She says, get out. And Bernie, his eyes are covered, but he recognizes my voice. And he said, no, it's okay. It's okay. I know him. And she says, and the nurse says to me, "You have 5 minutes." And she leaves. And then I start to talk to Bernie, and that's when he tells me kind of what happened and what the doctors have said. And there's bleeding internally in the eye socket, and they don't know where this is going to go. And it becomes very clear to me, oh, this is really bad. And I remember talking to Ed Viner, who was the Flyers physician, after I left the room. I mean, I was there I got my 5 minutes. The nurse came and got me, and I left. And then I saw Dr. Viner out in the hall. Dr. Viner, without giving me a whole lot of great detail, kind of said, "This is really serious." And I remember going there that day and just thinking, well, Bernie's hurt, but he'll be back. I mean, he's Bernie, for God's sakes. And then by the time I got in the car to drive back to the office to write my story, I had a whole different feeling. And I remember thinking, I think I just saw the end of a great career.
You explain in the book, and we won't take the time to tell why now, but that as a lot, the best to cover have been the hockey guys.
Yes.
And probably because a guy like Bernie, such a wonderful, wonderful guy. And also, they're a bunch of characters. Final question from me, and then I'm going to surrender the floor and pose some from the audience. But very touching to know that given your career and your half a century covering Philadelphia sports, and of course the photograph on the front, we all know where that picture was taken, that forever the Philly special will live on in history, not so much because of Ray Didinger, but because of David. Explain.
My son is a cameraman for NFL Films, has been for more than 20 years. Really good cameraman. He has an Emmy to prove it. But his assignment the day of Super Bowl 52 was he shot the Nick Foles wiring. And for anybody that understands how NFL Films works, you hear that sound, you hear guys talking in the game. They're actually mic'd. They're wearing a wire. There's a wire and a microphone built into their shoulder pads. And a couple of different guys are picked every week. And that day, they put the mic on Nick Foles, and my son was assigned to shoot nothing but Nick Foles. I mean, his whole camera, he did nothing but shoot Foles the whole day. Coming out the tunnel, playing in the game, on the sidelines, on the bench, he just shot Nick Foles. And so that wonderful moment right before halftime, when Nick Foles goes over to the sidelines on 4th down, and he and Doug Peterson are having this conversation about what are we going to run on 4th down at the 1 yard line. And Nick Foles says, "Hey, how about Philly, Philly?" And you can see Peterson isn't thinking that at all. I mean, not even anywhere in his brain is he thinking. And all of it, but he suddenly looks up, and it's clear to me that he sees something in Foles' eyes, that he sees something in Foles' face that it's like, he really believes in this, and he's the quarterback. He's the one who's going to have to make it work. If he believes in it, we're going with it. And that's when he says, yeah, let's do it. And so Foles comes back in, they run Philly special. People in Philadelphia will remember it forever. My goodness, they have a statue of it outside the stadium now. But the reason that we all know the full context of that play is because of my son, because that was his shot and he got it. And after the game, he's the one that told me up in the press box when he came to see me when we were doing the postgame show. He says to me very quietly, he says, "Hey, Dad, Foles called that play."
Wow.
I said, "What are you talking about?"
Wow.
He said, I was shooting the wire. I heard him. He's the one that said, "You want Philly, Philly." If Foles isn't wearing that wire, we know none of that. It's only because he was mic'd up. If he didn't wear that, we would have assumed that Doug called it, and it was a great play. Would have been a celebration and a win anyhow. but the fact that you actually now kind of see how the whole thing played out makes it so much better.
Ray, you speak as well as you write. You tell great stories. And I'm reminded that you worked for a great storyteller who left us too soon. As I look at the radio interviews that I've been privileged to conduct over 30 years, one that stands out for me is Steve Sable. And you are his match because the two of you have lived such interesting lives and write and speak so beautifully. Ray, there's a lot of love in the comments. The book is great for those who've not yet read it. Thanks. This was a lot of fun for me, and I hope I've made it clear how much I enjoyed the walk down memory lane with you and with a big slice of the sports history of Philadelphia.
Thanks, Mike. I really enjoyed it, and I hope folks enjoy the book. And all I can say is it's been a wonderful 50 years, and thank you all for sharing it with me.
Good night, everybody. Thanks, Ray.
Thank you, Michael.